In 1906, a dusty trail beside the Frisco Railroad tracks in North Tulsa, Oklahoma, had no name, no pavement, and no particular reason for anyone to remember it. 15 years later, the 40 acres that a man named O.W. Gurley had purchased along that trail held more than 190 black-owned businesses, a population of 10,000, 15 doctors, a hospital, a bus and taxi service, a savings and loan bank, 2 newspapers, and a 750-seat theater. Booker T. Washington visited on his way to speak in the all-black town of Boley and gave the district a name that stuck: Negro Wall Street. Economists and residents later estimated that every dollar spent in Greenwood changed hands 19 times before it left the community. In a country that had promised Black Americans freedom and delivered sharecropping, Greenwood delivered something closer to a functioning nation within a nation. By the spring of 1921, it was one of the wealthiest Black communities in the United States, comparable in ambition and density to Beale Street in Memphis or State Street in Chicago. And on the morning of June 1st, 1921, 35 blocks of it lay in ashes, its residents dead in the streets or herded into detention camps at gunpoint. The prosperity that Greenwood had built was visible for miles. In Tulsa, in 1921, visibility was a kind of danger. The land beneath Greenwood was Creek land before it was anything else. The Muskogee Creek Nation had been marched to Indian Territory in the 1830s along what is now called the Trail of Tears, and the Lockapoka Band established the settlement of Tulsa Town near the Arkansas River around 1836. For 60 years, the place remained a modest trading post and village, its post office not established until 1879, its incorporation as a town not formalized until 1898. The landscape was tallgrass prairie and blackjack oak, flat and wind-scoured, with nothing in the geology to suggest what lay beneath it. Then came oil. In 1901, a strike at Red Fork, just west of Tulsa, drew the first wildcatters and speculators. 4 years later, on November 22, 1905, Robert Galbraith and Frank Chesley completed the Ida E. Glen No. 1 at a depth of 1,481 feet on a farm 12 miles south of town. The well had been drilled in secrecy, but secrecy could not survive what it found. The Glen Pool discovery was staggering. Within 2 years, it produced more than 55,000 barrels a day, at a time when the entire rest of the United States produced roughly 100,000. The field generated more wealth than the California Gold Rush and the Nevada Silver Rush combined. Oklahoma became the nation's largest oil producer. Harry Sinclair and J. Paul Getty received their initial starts during the Glen Pool boom. Tulsa, an insignificant railroad town of 1,390 people in 1900, swelled to 18,182 by 1910 and 72,075 by 1920. By that year, it was home to 400 petroleum companies, 2 daily newspapers, more than 150 doctors, 200 attorneys, 7 banks, and 10,000 telephones. And it had crowned itself the oil capital of the world. Black Americans arrived alongside everyone else, drawn by the same oil wealth. Oklahoma held a unique position in black migration. Between 1865 and 1920, African Americans had founded roughly 50 all-black townships and settlements across the territory, more than any other state. The promise of land, self-governance, and distance from the brutalities of the Deep South drew thousands. But in Tulsa itself, the promise had limits. Jim Crow laws and white custom confined black residents to the north side of the Frisco Railroad tracks. Segregation was absolute, written into the city's geography as a physical boundary: Pine Street to the north, Archer Street and the Frisco tracks to the south, Cincinnati Street on the west, Lansing Street on the east. Into that confinement stepped Ottaway W. Gurley, born on Christmas Day 1868 in Huntsville, Alabama, to formerly enslaved parents, raised in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Self-educated, briefly a teacher and a postal worker, Gurley had participated in the 1889 Oklahoma land rush and run a general store in Perry, Oklahoma. When he heard about the oil being struck in Tulsa, he sold his store, moved south, and in 1906 purchased 40 acres of land in North Tulsa, imposing a restrictive covenant. The land could only be sold to black buyers. He named the road after Greenwood, Mississippi, the town many of the arriving black migrants had fled. The Frisco Railroad tracks formed the southern border. The covenant formed the walls. What Gurley intended to build inside those walls was a world that did not need the permission of white Tulsa to exist. He did not yet know that the walls would also form a trap. J.B. Stratford arrived in Tulsa in 1899, 6 years before Gurley. Born in 1861 in Versailles, Kentucky, the son of Julius Caesar Stratford, a man who had escaped slavery and taken the surname of the Canadian town where he found refuge. Stratford had graduated from Oberlin College, where he and his wife Augusta were the first black students to attend and graduate from the institution, and he had earned a law degree from Indiana Law School at the age of 38. He was a shrewd, restless businessman who had run pool halls, bathhouses, shoeshine parlors, and boarding houses in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, and St. Louis before hearing about the rapidly growing all-black towns in Indian Territory. In Gurley, Stratford found a kindred spirit. The two men formed an informal partnership, buying tracts of land in northeastern Tulsa, subdividing them, and selling exclusively to black entrepreneurs. Stratford believed that black Americans had the best chance of economic progress if they pooled their resources, supported one another's businesses, and kept their money circulating inside their own community. The theory worked. The labor that built Greenwood's wealth was unglamorous and exhausting. Black porters shined shoes in white Tulsa's hotel lobbies. Domestics cleaned the homes of oil executives. Janitors swept the offices of petroleum companies. Chauffeurs drove the automobiles of men who would not share a sidewalk with them. And every evening, those workers carried their wages north across the Frisco tracks and spent them in Greenwood. The businesses that rose to meet them filled every need. J.H. Goodwin's real estate office and funeral home, the Gurley's People's Grocery, barbershops where the smell of pomade mixed with the sound of argument, clothiers where a man could buy a suit that rivaled anything on Main Street. In 1914, Gurley's net worth was reported at $150,000, north of $3 million in today's money. He had built 3 two-story buildings, the Gurley Hotel, a Masonic lodge, and an employment agency. That same year, Stratford began planning his crowning achievement. By the beginning of 1917, I had amassed quite a fortune, he later wrote. I owned 15 rental houses, a 16-room brick apartment building. The rental value was $350 a month. The income from other sources were triple. I had a splendid bank account and was living on the sunny side of the street. I decided to realize my fondest hope, and that was to erect a large hotel in Tulsa, exclusively for my people. On June 1, 1918, the Stratford Hotel opened at 301 North Greenwood Avenue. 54 rooms, a dining hall, a saloon, a gambling room, a performance venue, chandeliers in the lobby, pressed brick above the windows, and stone slabs below. It was the largest black-owned and black-operated hotel in the United States, valued at $75,000, roughly $2.5 million today. Jazz from the Stratford Hotel and the Commodore Cotton Club across the street filled the evening air along Greenwood Avenue. Stratford claimed his building rivaled the Hotel Tulsa, the finest in the Southwest. By 1920, he was the richest black man in Tulsa. But Stratford was not content to build quietly. He litigated against the railroad for failing to provide proper black accommodations. He rallied publicly against Oklahoma's Jim Crow laws and spoke openly of blood in the streets if a lynching were ever attempted. Much of Tulsa's white community disapproved. The prosperity of Greenwood was visible from downtown, and the defiance of its leading citizen was audible across the tracks. On August 30, 1914, a woman named Lula Williams opened a pair of doors at 127 North Greenwood Avenue and let the neighborhood inside. The Williams Dreamland Theater seated 750 and cost $10,000 to build. Lula had insisted the theater be in her name alone, a declaration of financial independence rare for any woman in 1914, let alone a black woman in Oklahoma. The Tulsa Star called her the foremost businesswoman of the state among Negro women. Tickets cost 15 cents. The Dreamland showed silent films, hosted live vaudeville reviews from the Theater Owners Booking Association circuit, and staged boxing matches, lectures, and community meetings. For black Tulsans who could not enter a single white theater in town, the Dreamland offered something that had no dollar value, a room where they belonged. The Williams family eventually expanded to 2 more theaters in Okmulgee and Muskogee. By 1921, their combined net worth was reported at $150,000, roughly $2.2 million today. They were not alone. The single block of 100 North Greenwood Avenue held 4 hotels, 2 newspapers, 8 doctors' offices, 7 barbers, 9 restaurants, and a half-dozen offices for realtors, dentists, and lawyers. The district's 15 physicians included Dr. Andrew Cheeston Jackson, born in Memphis in 1879, the son of a formerly enslaved Union soldier. Jackson trained at Meharry Medical College, and according to the Mayo brothers, founders of the Mayo Clinic, he was the most able Negro surgeon in America. Some of the surgical tools he invented are still used in hospitals today. He treated patients of all races. Greenwood had built more than an economy. It had built a complete parallel society with its own schools, its own post office, its own churches. Vernon AME Church, founded in 1905, was completing its basement in 1919 and raising funds for a full sanctuary above it. A dollar still circulated 19 times before it crossed the Frisco tracks. This was the maneuver Greenwood kept making. Every exclusion answered with an institution. Every locked door answered with a new room. The problem was that the proof of concept was now impossible to ignore. A self-sufficient black city of 10,000, generating wealth comparable to the white districts around it, was visible, audible, and, to many in white Tulsa, intolerable. On the evening of May 31st, 1921, a Tuesday, the trouble that had been building for years arrived in the specific form of a LIE. The previous afternoon, a black teenager named Dick Rowland had entered an elevator at the Drexel Building on South Main Street. The white elevator operator, a young woman named Sarah Page, screamed. The most widely accepted explanation is that Rowland stepped on her foot. He fled. Police arrested him the following morning. By the time the Tulsa Tribune published its afternoon edition, the incident had become an attempted assault. Eyewitnesses later reported that the Tribune also ran an editorial, now lost, headlined, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." By 7:30 that evening, hundreds of white men had gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse, demanding that the sheriff hand over Rowland. The sheriff refused. Word of the gathering reached Greenwood. At approximately 9 o'clock, a group of about 25 armed black men, many of them veterans of the First World War, marched to the courthouse and offered their services to the sheriff to help protect the prisoner. A white man confronted a black veteran and attempted to disarm him. A shot was fired. From that moment, in the words Mary Jones Parrish would later record, quiet and peaceful Tulsa was turned into a hotbed of destruction. The armed white mob, rapidly swelling into the thousands, surged north across the Frisco Railroad tracks. By dawn on June 1st, the attack had become systematic. White men armed with rifles and machine guns moved block by block through Greenwood, looting homes and setting them ablaze. The Tulsa police chief deputized white civilians and authorized them to enter Greenwood to suppress what he called a Negro uprising. At least 6 airplanes circled overhead. Eyewitnesses, including the attorney B.C. Franklin, reported incendiaries dropped from the planes. "I could see planes circling in midair," Franklin later wrote in a manuscript recovered in 2015. "They grew in number and hummed, darted, and dipped low. I could hear something like hail falling upon the top of my office building. Down East Archer, I saw the old Midway Hotel on fire, burning from its top, and then another and another and another building began to burn from their top. Mary Jones Parrish, a journalist and typing teacher who had moved to Tulsa from Yazoo City, Mississippi, around 1919, was reading in her apartment when her young daughter, Florence Mary, called her to the window. "Mother, I see men with guns." Parrish and her daughter fled into the night under a hail of bullets. Across the district, Dr. A.C. Jackson walked toward a group of armed white men with his hands raised. His white neighbor, retired Judge John Oliphant, watched from nearby. Two men in the group recognized Jackson. "Don't shoot him!" one yelled. "2 gunshots!" Jackson fell. A third shot struck him on the ground. He bled to death at Convention Hall. He was 42 years old. No one was ever arrested for his murder. By noon, the governor had ordered the National Guard to impose martial law, but the damage was done. 35 blocks lay in charred ruins. More than 1,100 homes had been destroyed. Over 190 businesses, 12 churches, a hospital, and a school were gone. The Stratford Hotel, gone. The Dreamland Theater, gone. Mount Zion Baptist Church, gone. The Tulsa Star, gone. More than 800 people were treated for injuries. The official death toll was set at 36, but historians and the 2001 Oklahoma Commission now estimate as many as 300 people were killed, nearly all of them black. Close to 10,000 residents were left homeless. Property losses totaled more than $4 million in 1921 currency, roughly $150 million today. Of 88 indictments eventually returned, 74 were against black Tulsans. Not a single white attacker was convicted. The city of Tulsa offered to rebuild Greenwood. It did not. The community that had been bombed from the air was rebuilding within weeks. No one was coming to help. The scale of Greenwood's recovery is difficult to overstate. Unlike the aftermath of the 1889 Johnstown flood or San Francisco's 1906 earthquake, Greenwood received no outside aid, no government relief, no federal reconstruction money. The Red Cross provided tents, blankets, and some medical care, but the city and state offered nothing. White local leaders rejected outside donations, claiming they could handle the recovery, and then provided no financial support. Insurance companies denied every black claim, citing riot exclusion clauses written into standard policies. Survivors filed 193 lawsuits seeking approximately $1.8 million in damages. Nearly all were denied. The one successful claim favored a white gun shop owner whose inventory had been looted, a detail that requires no commentary. The city went further. Officials attempted to rezone Greenwood for industrial use, claiming the area was best suited for railroad yards and warehouses, a transparent effort to prevent black residents from returning to the land they owned. Attorney Buck Colbert Franklin, whose own law office had burned on East Archer, set up practice in a Red Cross tent 5 days after the massacre, working alongside 2 associates at folding tables while homeless families camped around them. Franklin challenged the rezoning ordinance in court and won, preserving the legal right of black Tulsans to rebuild on their own land. They did. About 60 days after the massacre, residents began salvaging bricks from the charred remains of Vernon AME Church and other structures. They hauled lumber, mixed mortar, and raised walls. Within 2 years, buildings were rising along Greenwood Avenue again. Reverend Solomon Sir Jones, a local minister with a motion picture camera, captured film footage from 1925 through 1928 that shows a Greenwood that is not mourning, but thriving. Pedestrians on crowded sidewalks, automobiles parked along the curb, storefronts open and lit. Vernon AME Church completed its full sanctuary by 1925, built atop the scorched basement where families had hidden. The congregation had worshiped the very first Sunday after the attack, in that same basement, with soot still on the walls. Booker T. Washington High School, one of the few structures untouched by the fire, held its graduation ceremony in June 1921 in Vernon's basement. because the school itself had been converted into a makeshift shelter for the wounded. Graduation and the junior and senior prom had been canceled because of the massacre, but the ceremony happened anyway, underground. A community that had been attacked from the air held commencement beneath the earth. By the 1940s, Greenwood had actually surpassed its pre-massacre peak, housing more than 200 businesses and continuing to serve as a cultural center for jazz and blues across the region. The Dreamland Theater was rebuilt by the Williams family, who refused to let the loss stand. The same maneuver played out again, for the second time in a generation. Exclusion answered with self-sufficiency. Destruction answered with construction. But the founders who had made it possible were gone. O.W. Gurley, arrested after the massacre, had implicated two other black leaders, J.B. Stratford and newspaper editor A.J. Smitherman, to secure his own release. Gurley lost nearly $200,000 of his fortune and eventually left for Los Angeles, where he and his wife Emma ran a small hotel in South Los Angeles. He died around 1935, at the age of 67, a continent away from the 40 acres he had purchased with the intention of building something permanent. Stratford, charged with inciting the massacre, learned in detention that he was slated for lynching and meticulously planned his escape. He fled to Chicago and never returned to Tulsa. He, too, died in 1935. The men who built Greenwood were broken by the very forces their creation had provoked, and the community they left behind was rebuilding on land the federal government had already decided to mark with a red line. In 1933, the Homeowners Loan Corporation graded Greenwood hazardous on its residential security maps, the practice known as redlining, ensuring that federal mortgage lending would bypass the district entirely. The rebuilt Greenwood was thriving, but it was not protected. The dollar that had once changed hands 19 times before it left Greenwood began in the 1950s and the 1960s to leave on the first transaction. Integration, the very goal the civil rights movement had fought for, paradoxically dissolved the captive market that had built Black Wall Street. Black consumers could now shop in white Tulsa's department stores, eat in restaurants that had been closed to them for half a century, enter the downtown theaters that had made the Dreamland necessary in the first place. The closed economic loop that had been Greenwood's greatest engine unwound quietly, one customer at a time. Fewer dollars stayed. Fewer businesses could survive on what remained. The aging of the early Greenwood pioneers compounded the loss. The generation that had rebuilt with their own hands was passing, and the next generation had options their parents never had. Then came the wound the city dealt itself, and this one was made of concrete. The Federal Aid Highway Acts of the 1960s authorized the construction of Interstate 244, and Tulsa's planners routed it directly through the heart of Greenwood, running east-west across the district like a blade. Hundreds of historic buildings were demolished. Families who had survived the massacre and rebuilt from nothing were displaced a second time, now by their own city's engineers. The physical bisection of the neighborhood severed the social and economic networks that had taken decades to reconstruct. The Dreamland Theater site, where Lula Williams had opened those doors in 1914, and where the community had gathered to plan its defense on the night of the massacre, ended up beneath a freeway overpass. Today, a commemorative plaque sits in front of a berm at the base of the interstate, and visitors have to wipe pine needles off it to read the words. U.S. Highway 75 sliced away most of the eastern edge and northern stretch of the district, cutting off blocks that had once been home to hundreds of families. The Tulsa Urban Renewal Authority targeted remaining properties. Ed Goodwin, a local businessman, refused to sell unless he received outright title to the remaining buildings on the once famous Greenwood Avenue. The authority agreed, and the 100 block was partially preserved, but it was, as historian Hannibal Johnson wrote, a skeleton of its former self, a block-long remnant of a 35-block district that had once held 242 black-owned businesses. Goodwin's brother James later reflected, what was characteristic of urban renewal authorities across the country was that right through the core of black neighborhoods, they drove their highways. The bitter irony is precise and worth sitting with. the same city government that failed to prosecute a single white attacker in 1921, that offered to rebuild and did not, that attempted to rezone the land to prevent black residents from returning, chose, 45 years later, to run its interstate through the neighborhood those attackers had tried to destroy. Vernon AME Church survived again. Its basement, the only black-owned structure still standing from the original Black Wall Street era, now sat a few yards from a highway overpass, surrounded by vacant land, parking lots, and silence. If you walk north along Greenwood Avenue today, you pass the Greenwood Rising History Center, which opened in 2021 on the site where Black Wall Street once stood. It is a state-of-the-art museum with immersive exhibits and survivor testimonials, funded by $30 million raised by the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. A few blocks farther, the John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park offers a place to sit with the weight of the story. Embedded in the sidewalks along Greenwood Avenue are bronze plaques marking where each business once stood: the Stratford Hotel, the Dreamland Theater, the Economy Drug Company, Dr. Jackson's office at Greenwood and Archer. Some of those plaques sit in front of empty lots. Some sit in front of parking garages. The Dreamland plaque sits beneath the Interstate 244 overpass. Across the street from the Greenwood Cultural Center stands Vernon AME Church, founded in 1905, its basement built in 1919, its sanctuary burned in 1921, and rebuilt by 1925. It remains the only intact black-owned structure from the original Greenwood. In February 2026, a groundbreaking ceremony launched the Vernon Witness Interpretive Center, a nationally funded preservation project that will transform the church's basement, the same basement where 300 residents hid during the massacre, into a museum and cultural center. The first phase is funded by a $1.5 million grant from the Mellon Foundation. Inside, the pillars still bear scorch marks from June 1, 1921. The wooden chairs from that night are being wrapped in glass for preservation. The ironies this story has earned are worth saying plainly. The city that offered to rebuild and did not. The insurance companies that denied every black claim and paid the one white claimant. The community that rebuilt itself without a dollar of outside help, only to be demolished again by its own government's highway. The reparations lawsuit filed by descendants and survivors, dismissed by the Oklahoma Supreme Court in June 2024, while the last known survivors of the massacre were still alive. And the maneuver that Greenwood's founders made in 1906, turning the walls of exclusion into the walls of a self-sustaining world, is being made again, right now, in that basement. The Vernon Witness Project is led by massacre descendants who insist on controlling their own story, building their own institution on the only ground that survived. The concrete walls are the same walls. The scorch marks have not been cleaned. The highway above has not been moved. The question of what is owed has never been answered. And on Sundays, the congregation still files in, as it has every Sunday since the first one after the fire, and worships above the room where their grandparents hid.